Sweet. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into the next basic sort of group of questions. And that has to do with developing outcomes and assessment. And so when we sit down at the beginning of a semester or something, and we're going to plan a class. And I think for a lot of us, this is really confusing. And I remember like when I started teaching, it was just, okay, go for it. And didn't have a whole lot of guidance, And so a lot of professors, we've done our PhDs or whatever, which means that we know more and more about less and less. And we spent a lot of time in a library by ourselves. And then all of a sudden we are given this charge of teaching a bunch of 20-year-olds Bible survey. And like, wow, I don't know. I guess I talk to them about it and teach them about it. And then we haven't thought a whole lot about where we go with the planning of the whole thing. So when we think about, outcomes and assessment, how do I get started? One of the a term that I think is really interesting, because this is all design, isn't it? I mean, and design is really hard. And when you look at like Apple as opposed to some other things like Microsoft, maybe Apple's whole thing is design. In fact, I've heard somebody say that Apple isn't a computer company. They're not a technology company. They're a design company, and it's all about design. And they just happen to design electronics, right? And so when we see good design, we recognize it, but actually doing this design is very hard. And so there's a phrase out there, or I guess it's a philosophy or an idea of backward design that has made a huge impact in education. Greg, how would you define backward design, and how should we think of that idea?
Well, like you said, Kent, sometimes when we start a class, when we're beginning our planning, what we do is we think in terms of content. I want to talk about this, I want to cover this material, but backward design calls on us to go all the way to the end product, and that is, what do we want our students to look like? How do we want their lives to be changed? How do we want their thinking to be transformed? What skills do we want them to require? And so we start there with what we want at the end, and we work backwards. It's a little bit like planning a vacation to Hawaii, thinking only in terms of your suitcases and things like that, and not stopping and thinking about, we're going to Hawaii. So it's not really about the clothes. Those are all avenues, and suitcases. All of those things are just tools to get you to the goal, and that is to get a massive sunburn on the beach in Hawaii.
And everything else is going to support that. Yeah. So
shaved ice. So I left it out.
So what's the first question then to ask if we're thinking of this backward design, maybe?
Well, I think Greg's on top of that. It's exactly that thought. So what do I want my students to know? How do I want them to change? How will this impact? What skills do I want to impart, or should they be able to master? So there's a variety of different things that go into that. So you're looking at the end result. So Greg used the word transformation. So if we're teaching towards that end, then how do I want my students to be transformed? So how am I going to engage them in ways throughout the class that will actually bring some sort of transformation in their lives? But it's through skill development. It could be a knowledge base, a data set that we want them to be able to have and articulate. Certainly we want doctors to walk away with a certain skill set. So it could be through labs or whatever it might be. So we have to ask those basic questions. Who do we want them to be? What do we want them to think? What skills do we need them to possess, et cetera, et cetera?
It's about priorities.
What difference will it make? I was just going to say one quick thing. What difference will it make that the student was in my class?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about the priorities. So if I use Greg's analogy of the vacation, I have all these little tiny things I do, but what I really need to do is get a plane ticket to Hawaii, because that's the end, right? That's where I'm headed. What am I going to, and then I begin to, from there, go, hey, where am I going to stay? What car am I going to, I have these priorities that have to be put in place. When I look at a textbook for my class, I think, how is this textbook going to help them get to where I want them to be at the end? What does this textbook offer? And I have to go through and create priorities within that textbook, and use that as a resource. So it's really about looking at how do I want them to be transformed? How do I want them to think? And then I look and I know that's the end. So I begin to set a series of priority moments in time that I go, so then I need to give them some of this, and I need to give them some of this, and I begin to prioritize, and I look at the resources. To me, a lot of people look at planning and say, chapter 1, that's what we're doing week 1. Chapter 2 is week 2. Chapter 3 is week 3. And while there's some merit to doing that, if you have a very sequential method you're teaching, you still need to know where they're going to end before you can start. So you prioritize what they read, what activities you give them, but you do that with the end in mind first.
We use the planning a vacation model in our education classes to teach planning. So Greg, you're right on target with that concept of planning a trip to Hawaii. The nice part is we all have a starting point. We have a syllabus that has a course title, a course description, and hopefully some course outcomes that are big and broad, overarching the whole class. It's important that you start there and then not get sucked into the minutia and the detail right away when you're thinking about what you want the outcomes to be or what they want to look like, is that you fast forward to the end and say, okay, based on these 5 course outcomes, this is what a student looks like that has accomplished that. Whatever those are, this is what it looks like. And once you have the beginning, the starting point, and the ending, then you get to, we're back to the art and science, then you get to craft what the 8 or 15 weeks worth of teaching in the middle looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were going to teach a class on tying your shoes, like you've been hired to
pick up on Aaron's art and craft.
Yes, yeah. So if you're going to be teaching a class how to tie your shoes, how do you start that? What's the first thing you do?
I've actually taught a class on how to tie your shoes.
Wow.
Because I teach first grade.
There you go.
And you start with, what's the end goal? The end goal is that kids can tie their shoes, right? And the end goal is that they become independent learners and they become independent in their skill set. So if that's the end goal of getting 6-year-olds to tie their shoes, so I don't have to tie 37 of them in a classroom, I got to figure out how to get them there. So I think, what do I need? I need prototypes. So I know what the end is. The end is tied shoes. Then I go backwards and say, how am I going to get them there? I'm going to get them there with some practice points. I'm going to get them there with some modeling. So for someone like me, that looks like 30-some cardboard cutouts of shoes with laces in them. And we begin a series of knowing how to take 2 laces and cross them. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's a process of priorities. It comes down to, I can't just say cross 2 strings and pull and your shoes are tied. It's a process of priorities. And those priorities are all linked to the final product.
And if you started with not showing them a shoe, you just said, okay, step 1, take this string and do this, and not really explain what you're doing or where you're going, the students would have no reason to be engaged because they don't know that they're eventually going to tie their shoe. And so starting with the prototype and explaining, this is the outcome, this is the end goal. We are going to end in Hawaii with tied shoes. Everybody's on board. Let's do this. Then when you come back and you start with step 1, it resonates with the students and they can see where they're headed.
This goes back to a discussion that we had on online classes and showing the big picture. If you show them where they're headed, Hawaii, tying their shoes, and then you take them back and say, but I'm here to walk you through the process to get there because I've organized these series of events to help you get to this point that seems kind of big and hard right now. That's what the student needs in order to feel confident in trying and taking a risk and learning something new.
And I would say too,
Also, when we think about the steps, when I think about tying a shoe, I would like us to think about the kinds of outcomes. Because Aaron, you started with the idea that we would have a set number of outcomes for a course. Sometimes we need to make sure that those outcomes are worth pursuing. Because if we could at the end say, we want students to be able to recall the steps for tying a shoe. So as we think about Bloom's taxonomy, that's the bottom, but that's not the goal. Ultimately, we want them to be able to tie their shoe. And even better, if they come back on Monday after our week of shoe tying, and they say, look what I did, teacher. I not only learned how to tie my shoe, I tied up my dad while he was sleeping in the Barca lounger today. So then they applied their skill to a new area.
Wow.
So we want to make sure that we set our goals high enough.
Well, and it goes back, I mean, I said in the last video too, less is more, right? If you might have fewer course outcomes if they are higher level and ability to be transferred or synthesized into another area, another concept. We want to make sure that we prioritize and focus on what is essential to our course and what we're trying to do. So if that means you only have 3 course outcomes, but you're gonna really dive in and get your students to be able to do those and be able to abstract them out into different areas. That's really important in the beginning design phase. You don't just end the semester like, oh, we've made it here. Like, I didn't know that we were in Hawaii, but we swam and we got here. So great. You need to have that as an intentional target at the beginning when you start.
And it's a fine art between making your goals and your outcomes either too generalized or too specific. And so, for example, in teaching the Bible, we always talk about, certainly you want to introduce whatever you're teaching, a concept with an overall big idea. So everybody goes, okay, I get it. That's where we're going for the day. So I know where we're going for the day. But when you move towards the application part of that, you're thinking more about specific and possible and measurable kinds of outcomes. You can't just say at the end of a Bible lesson, okay, everybody go and love the world like Jesus loved the world. Well, okay, that's a nice saying, but what does that mean? I don't know. So we need some sort of specific, possible and measurable outcomes so that we know that the person has actually, they can tie their shoe. That's specific, it's possible, and it's measurable. We wouldn't say, here's a shoe, now do with it whatever you want. It doesn't. Okay, it helps you walk, but it doesn't. If I don't know how to tie a shoe, so you gotta. That's a challenge, I think, of crafting really good objectives and outcomes, is not being too general. So, hey, we're going to learn about this, or too specific, exactly this, and that's the only thing we're going to learn. So, that's a challenge.
And that might be a good resource to have, just something on how to write good objectives, because that is so tricky. And I've heard different, that your objective should be super detailed, right? Like, and we need to avoid words like learn and understand, right? And those, because you can't measure that, right? And that doesn't lead us anywhere. So
we have a whole class on writing outcomes, goals, and objectives in the ed department. So Jen and I spend 2 semesters, fall, spring, instructional alignment, talking about the art and science of how do you do this. And I guess I would say if the concept of backwards design is new to you or overwhelming and just hearing about it, we're always tweaking, we're always coming back and improving and making it better. So I would suggest try it for a semester, try it for a course, and if you end up having an outcome that you actually didn't get there, or it didn't fit where you wanted, you come back and you tweak it. You make it different for the next time you're going to teach it, or maybe a different aspect of the course came to the top, like surfaced, and you didn't realize that was such a big aspect of an outcome that you wanted. And so you can go back and redesign and reevaluate how you're going to do it the next time you teach it. You don't have to get it exactly right the first time you do it.
So how much, so this is a question I should know the answer to, and I sort of do, but aren't those objectives given to us in like the course description, right? Like, so if I'm teaching a class, intro to theology, I get somebody's syllabus who's taught it before, there's objectives listed in that. Am I limited to those? Do I have freedom to play around with that a little bit?
Well, we're guided first by our mission, and then we do have overall goals that we have for all of our students.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about how all the pieces line up, at the top is our mission. Underneath those are the goals that we have for all of our students. And then we begin asking ourselves, where do our majors and our minors and our courses fit in underneath those, and how do they connect with those? But within those parameters, we have a lot of freedom to develop outcomes.
Yeah, I agree with Greg. I think you're following kind of it's more of kind of a business model, that you have your overall mission. Certainly, as an institution, we have our mission as an institution. Then you have underneath that certain values that you adhere to, so or purposes, whatever they might be. And then you have the further articulation of those. This is how we're going to live that out. So I think course descriptions fit more within the mission, the goals, and the objectives. That's really our philosophy or purpose, or those kinds of things. And then the objectives are further outflow of that, if that makes sense. But that's kind of a business model. You look on any website of Starbucks, I do this in class, I look at Starbucks versus Dutch Bros, and we look at their mission, their values, and then their purpose, and the way that they flow that out. Well, they're two uniquely, even though they both sell coffee, they're doing it with different strategies in mind, with a different mission in mind, certainly with different values in mind, certainly with different purpose in mind, even though they're still serving coffee. And that's why they draw a certain kind of client base. Kent, you referred to the Apple model and recently about, their whole thing is about design. And so that's an important thing. And so I think it just follows that kind of that flow.
So then it could be that two different classes of intro to theology, there could be different objectives in there, right? Different outcomes?
Well, you're getting into semantics a little bit here, and it would probably be helpful for everybody to use the same words to refer to the same things, the like things. The way that we treat it, at least in the education department, is that the broad, big concepts are called outcomes and goals. And so outcomes would be like for a whole semester, where Greg was talking, Greg and Sam, this is what we want a student to look like at the end of the semester. That's an outcome. A goal would be a broad, overarching target for a unit of study, whether that's, we're going to spend the next 4 weeks talking and discussing this or that. It's a broader time frame within the semester. And then objectives, we refer to objectives as the daily target. And so there might be 1 or 2 objectives for each class period, whether it's online, whether it's hybrid, whether it's face-to-face, whatever my block of time or my lesson is, I have an objective or 2 that I'm going to make sure that students can do. And those are really focused and targeted based on what the strategies are for that day. The challenge always is back to that alignment and that backwards planning. I have to start with the mission of the entire university and the department, but then for my course, I have the outcomes. And so my goals and objectives need to support those outcomes. If I walk into a lesson or a class and my objective doesn't relate to one of my 4 course outcomes, that's a wasted day. What are we doing? Yeah. There's no point in us having that lesson. And so there has to be some alignment through, it's a funnel, right? As you go down that funnel. Jen, we teach that class together. Anything that you want to add to how we do those?
That's helpful.
I think you've really explained it well. I'll give an example of this year. I rewrote a class and I moved it from bigger chunks to smaller chunks. So I moved it to like these mini modules. I wanted students to have 2 to 3 weeks of just really intense instruction in these little modules. And so I went back to the big outcomes of the course to create this new format and this new look to the content. It was the same content I've taught before, but I needed to make it better. And so I went back to the outcomes. I looked at the goals. The goals became the modules, and the objectives became the small pieces within the modules that then impacted what I taught every day. And those objectives became measurable. I wrote them to be measurable, and they always went back to the big goal. So even though I had chunked the class up into pieces, I always had to tie back to the goal, which was tied to the outcomes. So we teach it like a funnel, because the daily stuff has to be the little specifics that I can measure. So later on, as we talk about assessment, we talk about the ways we measure the little things versus the big things, but it's always got to cycle back, big to little. You take your big idea, you break it into medium ideas, and then the daily stuff are the little ideas, and they're always tied together.
And Kent, this is where your question, if we have 2 intro to theology classes, well, no, there may look a little bit different, but those outcomes would be the same, because as a department, we decide what those outcomes are for that. And even some of the goals might be the same, but some of the objectives may differ. For example, we have 5 sections on average of teaching the Bible every semester. So when I meet with all the adjuncts and myself, we have clear laid out outcomes for that. This is exactly what we want as far as the outcomes. And in the goals, we have some similarity there. There are certain kinds of skills we want to impart, certain kinds of introductions to learning theory, etc. But there are other objectives that the faculty, they're totally free on how they want to do that. The creativity that they want to bring to the classroom, nuances related to their particular strategies and those kinds of things. And that's great. That's what we want. And so, but yeah, we're all on the same page as far as those outcomes go.
That's really
We're
helpful.
still on our way to Hawaii.
So if we're thinking about this,